Mary Poppins by P. L. Travers. Chapter 5. The Dancing Cow. Jane, with her head tied up in Mary Poppins' bandana handkerchief, was in bed with earache. "What does it feel like?" Michael wanted to know. "Like guns going off inside my head," said Jane. "Cannons?" "No, pop guns." "Oh," said Michael, and he almost wished he could have an earache too. It sounded so exciting. "Shall I tell you a story out of one of the books?" said Michael, going to the bookshelf. "No, I just couldn't bear it," said Jane, holding her ear with her hand. "Well, I shall sit at the window and tell you what's happening outside." "Well, shall I sit at the window and tell you what's happening outside?" "Yes, do," said Jane. So Michael sat all afternoon on the window seat, telling her everything that occurred in the lane, and sometimes his accounts were very dull and sometimes very exciting. "There's Admiral Boom," he said once. "He has come out of his gate, and is hurrying down the lane. Here he comes. His nose is redder than ever, and he's wearing a top hat. Now he's passing next door." "Is he saying 'blast my gizzard'?" inquired Jane. "I can't hear. I expect so. There's Miss Lark's second housemaid in Miss Lark's garden, and Robertson A. in our garden, sweeping up the leaves, and looking at her over the fence. He is sitting down now, having a rest." "He has a weak heart," said Jane. "How do you know?" "He told me. He said his doctor said he was to do as little as possible, and I heard Daddy say if Robertson A. does what his doctor told him to do, he'll sack him." "Oh, how it bangs and bangs!" said Jane, clutching her ear again. "Hullo!" said Michael, excited from the window. "What is it?" cried Jane, sitting up. "Do tell me." "It's a very extraordinary thing. There's a cow down the lane," said Michael, jumping up and down on the window seat. "A cow? A real cow right in the middle of town? How funny!" Mary Poppins, said Jane. "There's a cow in the lane. Michael says so." "Yes, it's walking very slowly, putting its head over every gate and looking round as though it has lost something." "I wish I could see it," said Jane mournfully. "Look!" said Michael, pointing downward at Mary Poppins came to the window. "A cow! Isn't that funny?" Mary Poppins gave a quick, sharp glance down into the lane. She started with surprise. "Certainly not," she said, turning to Jane and Michael. "It's not funny at all. I know that cow. She's a great friend of my mother's, and I'll thank you to speak politely of her." She smoothed her apron and looked at them both very severely. "Have you known her long?" inquired Michael, gently, hoping that if he was particularly polite he would hear something more about the cow. "Since before she saw the king," said Mary Poppins. "And when was that?" asked Jane in a soft, encouraging voice. Mary Poppins stared into space, her eyes fixed upon something that they could not see. Jane and Michael held their breath, waiting. "It was long ago," said Mary Poppins in a brooding, storytelling voice. She paused, as though she were remembering events that had happened hundreds of years before that time. Then she went on dreamily, still gazing into the middle of the room, but without seeing anything. "The Red Cow, that's the name she went by, and very important and prosperous she was." 2. So my mother said. She lived in the best field in the whole district, a large one full of buttercups the size of saucers and dandelions, rather larger than brooms. The field was all primrose colours, and gold, with the buttercups and dandelions standing up in it like soldiers. Every time she ate the head off one soldier, another grew up in its place, with a green military coat and a yellow busby. She had lived there, always. She often told my mother that she couldn't remember the time when she hadn't lived in that field. Her world was bounded by green hedges and the sky, and she knew nothing of what lay beyond these. The Red Cow was very respectable. She always behaved like a perfect lady, and she knew what was what. To her a thing was either black or white. There was no question of it being grey or perhaps pink. People were good or they were bad. There was nothing in between. Dandelions were either sweet or sour. There were never any moderately nice ones. She led a very busy life. Her mornings were taken up giving lessons to the red calf, her daughter, and in the afternoon she taught the little one deportment and mooing and all the things a really well brought-up calf should know. Then they had their supper, and the red cow showed the red calf how to select a good blade of grass from a bad one, and when her child had gone to sleep that night, she would go into a corner of the field and chew the cud and think her own quiet thoughts. All her days were exactly the same. One red calf grew up and went away, and another came in its place. And it was natural that the red cow should imagine that her life would always be the same as it always had been. Indeed, she felt that she could ask for nothing better than for all her days to be alike till she came to the end of them. But at the very moment she was thinking these thoughts, adventure, as she afterwards told my mother, was stalking her. It came upon her one night when the stars themselves looked like dandelions in the sky, and the moon a great daisy among the stars. On this night, long after the red calf was asleep, the red cow stood up suddenly and began to dance. She danced wildly and beautifully and in perfect time, though she had no music to go by. Sometimes it was a polka, sometimes a Highland fling, and sometimes a special dance that she made up out of her own head. And between these dances she would curtsy and make sweeping bows and knock her head against the dandelions. "Dear me," said the red cow to herself as she began a sailor's hornpipe, "what an extraordinary thing! I always thought dancing improper, but it can't be, since I myself am dancing, for I am a model cow." And she went on dancing and thoroughly enjoying herself. At last, however, when she grew tired and decided that she had danced enough and she would go to sleep. But to her great surprise she found that she could not stop dancing. When she went to lie down beside the red calf, her legs would not let her. They went on capering and prancing, and of course carrying her with them. Round and round the field she went, leaping and waltzing and stepping on tiptoe. "Dear me," she murmured at intervals with a ladylike assent. "How very peculiar!" But she couldn't stop. In the morning she was still dancing, and the red calf had to take its breakfast of dandelions all by itself, because the red cow could not remain still enough to eat. All through the day she danced up and down the meadow, and round the meadow, with the red calf mooing piteously behind her. When the second night came, and she was still at it, and still could not stop, she grew very worried, and at the end of a week of dancing she was nearly distracted. "I must go and see the king about it," she decided, shaking her head. So she kissed her red calf and told it to be good. Then she turned and danced out of the meadow and went to tell the king. She danced all the way, snatching little sprays of green food from the hedges as she went, and every eye that saw her stared with astonishment, but none of them were more astonished than the red cow herself. At last she came to the palace where the king lived. She pulled the bell rope with her mouth, and when the gate opened she danced through it and up the broad garden path till she came to the flight of steps that led to the king's throne. Upon this the king was sitting, busily making a new set of laws. His secretary was writing them down in a little red notebook, one after another, as the king thought of them. There were courtiers and ladies in waiting everywhere, all very generously dressed, and all talking at once. "How many have I made today?" asked the king, turning to his secretary. The secretary counted the laws he had written down in the red notebook. 72, Majesty," he said, bowing low and taking care not to trip over his quill pen, which was a very large one. Not bad for an hour's work," said the king, looking very pleased with himself. "That's enough for today." He stood up and arranged his ermine cloak very tastefully. "Order my coach, I must go to the barber's," he said magnificently. It was then that he noticed the red cow approaching. He sat down again and took up his sceptre. "What have we here, ho?" he demanded, as the red cow danced at the foot of the steps. "A cow, your Majesty," she answered simply. "I can see that," said the king. "I still have my eyesight, but what do you want? Be quick, because I have an appointment with the barber at 10. He won't wait for me longer than that, and I must have my hair cut. And for goodness sake, stop jigging and jagging about like that," he added irritably. "It makes me quite giddy." "Quite giddy," echoed all the courtiers, staring. "That's just my trouble, your Majesty. I can't stop," said the red cow piteously. "Can't stop? Nonsense," said the king furiously. "Stop at once. I, the king, command you." "Stop at once. The king commands you," cried the courtiers. The red cow made a great effort. She tried so hard to stop dancing that every muscle and every rib stood out like mountain ranges all over her, but it was no good. She just went on dancing at the foot of the king's steps. "I have tried, your Majesty, and I can't. I've been dancing now for 7 days running, and I've had no sleep, and very little to eat, a white thorn spray or two, and that's all, so I've come to ask your advice." Very curious," said the king. pushing his crown to one side and scratching his head. "Very curious," said the courtiers, scratching their heads too. "What does it feel like?" asked the king. "Funny," said the red cow, and yet," she paused, as if choosing her words, "it's rather a pleasant feeling, too, as if laughter were running up and down inside me." "Extraordinary," said the king, and put his chin in his hand and stared at the red cow, pondering on what was the best thing to do. Suddenly he sprang to his feet and said, "Good gracious!" "What is it?" cried all the courtiers. "Why, don't you see," said the king, getting very excited and dropping his scepter, "what an idiot I was not to notice it before, and what idiots you were?" He turned furiously upon the courtiers. "Don't you see that there's a fallen star on her horn?" "So there is!" cried the courtiers, and they all suddenly noticed the star for the first time, and as they looked it seemed to them that the star grew brighter. "That's what's wrong," said the king. "Now, you courtiers had better pull it off, so that this lady can stop dancing and have some breakfast. It's the star, madam, that is making you dance," he said to the red cow. "Now come along, you." And he motioned the chief courtier, who presented himself smartly before the red cow, and began to tug at the star. It would not come off. The chief courtier was joined by another and another of the courtiers, until at last there were a long chain of them, each holding the man in front of him by the waist, and a tug-of-war began between the courtiers and the star. "Mind my head," said the red cow. "Pull harder!" roared the king. They pulled harder. They pulled until their faces were red as raspberries. They pulled till they could pull no longer, and all fell back, one on top of the other. The star did not move. It remained firmly fixed on the horn. "Ch-ch-ch," said the king. "Secretary, look in the encyclopedia and see what it says about cows with stars on their horns." The secretary knelt down and began to crawl under the throne. Presently he emerged, carrying a large green book, which was always kept there in case the king wanted to know something. He turned the pages. "There's nothing at all, your majesty, except the story of the cow who jumped over the moon, and you know all about that." The king rubbed his chin, because that helped him to think. He sighed irritably and looked at the red cow. "All I can say," he said, "is that you'd better try that too." "Try what?" said the red cow. "Jumping over the moon. It might have an effect, worth trying anyway." "Me?" said the red cow with an outraged stare. "Yes, you. Who else?" said the king impatiently. He was anxious to get to the barbers. "Sire," said the red cow, "I beg you to remember that I am a decent, respectable animal, and have been taught from my infancy that jumping was no occupation for a lady." The king shook his scepter at her, and the king stood up and shook his scepter at her. "Madam," he said, "you came here for my advice, and I have given it to you. Do you want to go on dancing forever? Do you want to go hungry forever? Do you want to go sleepless forever?" The red cow thought of the lush, sweet taste of dandelions. She thought of meadow grass and how soft it was to lie on. She thought of her weary, capering legs and how nice it would be to rest them, and she said to herself, "Perhaps just for once it wouldn't matter, and nobody except the king need know." "How high do you suppose it is?" she said aloud as she danced. The king looked up at the moon. "At least a mile, I should think," said he. The red cow nodded. She thought so too. For a moment she considered, and then she made up her mind. "I never thought that it should come to this, your majesty. Jumping, and over a moon at that. But I'll try," she said, and curtsied gracefully to the throne. "Good," said the king pleasantly, realizing that he would be in there for the barber after all. That he would be in time for the barber after all. "Follow me." He led the way into the garden, and the red cow and the courtiers followed him. "Now," said the king, when he reached the open lawn, "when I blow the whistle, jump." He took a large golden whistle from his waistcoat pocket, and blew it lightly to make sure there was no dust in it. The red cow danced at attention. "Now 1," said the king, 2, 3. Then he blew the whistle, and there we will pause.